Listen, that crunch is the sound of the world ending. 10,000 hobnailed sandals grinding into sand. A short sword knocking against chainmail. Leather straps groaning under a 70-pound pack. The man carrying it feels his wool tunic turn to sandpaper, soaked in sweat that cools nothing. He raises his shield, his scutum, to block the light. The polished curve becomes a mirror. It throws the sun straight back into his eyes. His enemy is not the Parthian horse archer a mile off. His enemy is the air. Each breath enters his lungs like fire. This was the promise of the East. The golden eagle held high, leading the legions toward marble cities and plunder enough to make a man a king in his own village. They marched dreaming of silk and spices, of arches raised in their honor back in Rome. Then look at the soldier 10 feet from the standard. He doubles over and vomits yellow bile into the sand. His body is failing, and he has not yet seen a single enemy. His armor is no longer a shell. It is an oven. This was not conquest. It was a march into a furnace. The greatest battles Rome fought in the East were never against armies. They were against the sun. For centuries, the most efficient killing machine the world had ever built hurled itself at an enemy it could not stab, could not frighten, could not nail to a cross. This is the story of that war. A war against the desert itself. A war where the only victory was staying alive, and survival cost you a piece of your soul. Tell us which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. Take a moment to subscribe and support this project, because what you are about to see comes from thousands of hours of research. You're watching Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. The armor was a man's second skin. It was his shield, his name, his link to the brotherhood of the legion. In the forests of Gaul, or the wet hills of Britannia, the overlapping iron of the lorica segmentata and the linked rings of the lorica hamata formed a wall of steel. They turned a Celtic longsword. They stopped a German spear. Under the Syrian sun, they turned on the man wearing them. The Romans had a word for it. Fornax, an oven. A full set of segmentata weighed close to 20 pounds. Every plate was riveted to leather straps that ran with sweat and then dried stiff as bark. The sun struck the polished shoulder guards, and the iron began to warm. First it was pleasant, then it was hot. Then it was a searing plate no bare hand could touch. Through the thin wool tunic it branded the skin, raising long blisters that wept down a man's back. He was cooking inside the thing built to keep him alive. The air carried the smell of scorched wool and sweat flashing to steam. Underneath it, faint, was the smell of his own flesh. That was only the surface. The real war was fought inside the body, and every man was going to lose it. The dismantling followed a pattern. First came thirst so total it swallowed everything else. Lips cracked and split. The tongue swelled into a dry stick that made it impossible to choke down the hard biscuit of army bread. That biscuit had a name: bucellatum. Twice baked, hard as terracotta, it needed water or wine to soften. In the desert, there was neither, so the men gnawed it dry until their gums bled. The daily ration also called for salt. Salt in a body already losing its water is a slow poison, and no centurion on that march knew it. The body, starved of liquid, began pulling water from its own supply. The blood thickened. It turned to sludge. The heart, that Roman pump built for efficiency, now worked twice as hard, then 3 times, forcing syrup through the veins. You could hear it, a frantic hammering pulse inside your own skull. Then the kidneys went. Dry, they stopped filtering waste. The poisons rose like a tide. Then the mind cracked. The glare off the sand built mirages, and a man would see a blue lake shimmering on the horizon. He would scream with joy, break ranks, and sprint toward it. He clawed at empty sand where he fell. Others saw Parthian cavalry pouring out of the heat haze. They drew their swords and shouted challenges at nothing, then dropped from the effort of the shouting. Some, driven past reason, drank their own urine. Some cut open the pack mules for the fluid in the gut. And Strabo notes that even the water they did find in that country was foul enough to sicken a man who drank it. The desert did not simply kill the Roman soldier. It took him apart while he was still marching. The land itself was a weapon, sharper than any ambush. A legionary from Italy knew a world with features: hills, rivers, forests, towns. A landmark ahead told you how far you had come. The desert gave you nothing: an ocean of sand and stone, a horizon that stayed fixed no matter how many miles you burned through. The emptiness pressed on a mind that lived for order and boundaries. For days, the only sounds were the tramp of sandals, the creak of leather, and the low groan of men beginning to break. No birds, no running water, a dead silence that made every sound of suffering louder. When the wind rose, it did not cool them. It came off the sand as a hot breath and drove grit into every seam of the armor, into the eyes, into the mouth, into the bread. A man chewed sand with his last biscuit and swallowed it because there was nothing else. At night, the desert turned on them from the other side. The heat that had cooked them by day fled the moment the sun dropped. The cold came fast and hard, and men who had sweated out their last water shivered in tents pitched on ground still warm underfoot. Strabo noted the swing between the two: a land that burned you at noon and froze you at midnight. There was no season of mercy in it, only the two edges of the same blade. The sun sat in a bleached white sky like an eye. Its glare burned the eyes the way snow blinds a man in the mountains. Vision blurred. Eyes stung as if packed with hot grit. The world dissolved into a searing white. This was engineered to shatter the one thing that made a legion, its discipline. How do you hold a straight marching line when the men in it can no longer see? How do you give an order to soldiers half mad and seeing ghosts? The desert was not a place. It was an enemy with a plan, and the plan was to lock each man alone inside his own pain until the whole legion melted into a mob of the dying. Rome had seen this kind of death before and ignored the warning. In 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, took 7 legions east to conquer Parthia. He crossed the Euphrates and marched onto the flat plain near Carrhae, in what is now southeastern Turkey. Plutarch tells the horror of it. The Parthian horse archers ringed his men and fed arrows into them for hours under a sun that gave the Romans nowhere to hide. Camels stood behind the archers loaded with spare arrows, so the barrage never stopped. When the legionaries locked shields into the testudo, the archers switched to heavy cavalry with lances. When the Romans opened up to meet the lances, the arrows came again. Crassus lost around 20,000 dead and 10,000 captured. His own son Publius charged out with a small force and was cut down, and the Parthians rode back to the trapped legions holding Publius's head on a spear. Crassus himself was killed under a false flag of truce. Cassius Dio passes on the legend that the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, a mockery of the greed that had brought him east. The captured eagles stayed in Parthian hands for a generation. Their loss was a wound Rome could not forget, and getting them back would become an obsession of the very emperor about to repeat the mistake. Rome had learned that the East drank armies. 27 years later, Augustus sent one more into the sand. Around 26 BC, Augustus decided to take Arabia Felix, the land we now call Yemen. It was legend made real, the source of the world's frankincense and myrrh, resins burned on every altar in the empire, and worth more than gold by weight. Whoever held the spice roads held a fortune, and Rome wanted the source, not the middleman. Augustus had just closed the doors of the Temple of Janus, the sign that Rome was at peace. A quick conquest of the fabled spice land would crown that peace with glory and pay for it in gold. He handed the task to Aelius Gallus, prefect of Egypt and a friend of the geographer Strabo. There was a second motive Rome kept quieter. Augustus wanted to know the land. He wanted maps, water sources, the strength of the Sabaean kings, the roads the caravans used. Gallus went as conqueror and as spy, and both errands demanded he march deep into ground no legion had ever crossed. Gallus built a hammer, 10,000 Roman legionaries, 1,000 Nabateans under a commander named Silaeus, and 500 Judeans sent by King Herod. A balanced army made to crush any kingdom in its path. He built a fleet of 80 warships at Cleopatris on the Red Sea, then found there was no navy to fight, and switched to 130 transports. The kingdom he invaded was not made of men. It was made of sand and sun. The crossing broke the plan before it began. Strabo says the transports had to pick their way through waters thick with reefs, and the voyage from Egypt to the port of Leucacome ran 15 days when it should have run far less. Men came ashore sick from the sea and from a foul disease already loose in the ranks. Gallus wintered there, bleeding time and lives, before the land march even started. Their guide was Silius, the Nabatean minister. He promised to lead them across the desert to the spice lands. He was lying. Silius played a double game, working to wreck the Roman army and protect his own kingdom's grip on the spice trade. He avoided the known caravan routes. He led them into the waterless heart of the peninsula, along roads that doubled back on themselves. He led them in circles for months when the direct march should have taken weeks. When a hard road offered a shortcut, he steered them onto the long one. When water lay close, he marched them past it. Every choice was made to kill Romans, and every choice looked like the counsel of a loyal guide. Strabo, who had the story straight from Gallus himself, wrote down the nightmare that followed. The legion marched and found nothing. The wells Silius had promised were dry, empty, or spaced too far apart to reach alive. The sun did not let up. A sickness swept the camp. One Strabo names stomachache and selaturbe. The gums rotted, and the teeth loosened in the jaw. The legs seized so a man could not walk. It was scurvy and worse, born of a diet of dry biscuit, bad water, and oil, with nothing living in it. Men who had survived Gaul now could not stand, their mouths bleeding, their joints locked. They reached a town Strabo calls Negrana and took it. They reached a place he calls Marciaba and laid siege. They ran out of water after 6 days and pulled back short of the walls, Strabo says, just 2 days' march from the frankincense country itself. They had come the length of a hostile desert and stopped within reach of the prize, beaten not by the men on the walls, but by empty water skins. According to Strabo, only 7 Romans died in actual combat the entire campaign. The rest died of thirst, hunger, and disease. That single number tells the whole story. The enemy barely had to lift a sword. The legion was not defeated. It was consumed, erased. On the road back, more men fell than on the road out, because now they were weaker, and Sylleus led them by a longer path still, 60 days through country that had nearly killed them once. The return took them through towns Strabo names, Anagrana, Egra, until they reached a village called Negra by the sea and the port of Myos Hormos. Gallus dragged the survivors across the water to Alexandria. He had lost most of his army. He had not lost it to an army. He had lost it to geography and to one man's lie. The grand conquest of Arabia Felix, meant to crown the reign of Augustus, ended as a silent catastrophe. Rome did take its measure of Sylleus in the end. Years later, the Nabatean came to Rome on other business, was accused before Augustus, and was beheaded. It was one life for thousands. The desert kept the rest. Death on the march followed a fixed order, a brutal sorting. The animals went first. The mules and donkeys, loaded with tents, grain mills, and the entrenching tools, dropped before the men did. Their bodies were stripped of anything useful and left where they fell. The sun went to work within the hour. The carcass swelled and bloated, the skin stretching tight as a drum until it burst with a wet crack, releasing a stench that hung in the air for miles. Flies came from nowhere in a place with nothing. The legion marched on. Now the weight those animals had carried was shared among the men. Every pack grew heavier. Every end came closer. Next went the weakest soldiers. The new recruits, the Tyrones, not yet hardened to endless marching. Or a veteran burning with fever, already hollowed out. He would begin to lag. At first his tent group, his contubernium, the 8 men who shared a tent and a cooking pot and a mule, tried to help, carrying his pack, carrying his shield. Then they hit their own limit. The man stumbled and fell. The column did not stop. It could not stop. To halt 10,000 for one was to kill them all. The centurion walked past, his face set like stone. The man's friends looked away. He was left there, one kneeling figure in a vast emptiness, watching the army's dust vanish over the horizon. A sacrifice to the sun. He understood it. It was the law of the desert. There was a cruelty built into the system that made it worse. Roman discipline forbade a soldier from throwing away his gear on the march. The historian Josephus, who watched Roman legions move through Judea a century later, marveled that a legionary carried 3 days of rations, a saw, a basket, an axe, a strap, a sickle, and a chain on top of shield and armor. He called each man a walking fortress. Vegetius, writing on Roman drill, records that a soldier was trained to cover 20 Roman miles in 5 summer hours under that load, and 24 at the faster step. In Italy, that made an army no one could match. In Arabia, it made a coffin a man carried on his own back. A soldier who dropped his pack to survive faced a flogging if he lived. So most kept the weight, until the weight killed them. Discipline was Rome's finest weapon. It was forged in harsh training camps and tempered across 100 battlefields. Here, in the heat, it began to fail. A centurion could flog a man for breaking rank. He could not flog the sun. An officer could execute a soldier for insubordination. He could not execute the horizon. Tacitus, writing of later Eastern campaigns, shows how fast a starving, thirsty legion slid from an army into a crowd, how the vine staff of the centurion lost its bite once men stopped fearing punishment more than the march. The bond that held the contubernium together frayed first. A man who would have died for the soldier beside him in Germania now watched that same soldier fall and kept walking, because to stop was to join him. The men who marched under that sun swore an oath, to the eagle, to the emperor. For those who love this history and want it told with real depth and care, there is an inner circle. We call it the Praetorian Guard. Joining the channel membership is more than support. It is taking your post in the ranks. You stand watch over this history and keep these deep investigations into the Roman world alive. If you are loyal to the mission, your post is waiting. Click the Join button and take your place in the Guard. The disaster in Arabia shook Rome. It exposed a truth no one wanted to face. The Roman art of war, sharpened across 500 years of conquest, had a blind spot. It was built to beat men. It knew how to break a phalanx, storm a fortress, outflank a cavalry charge. It had no answer for an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. No plan for a foe you could not bribe, frighten, or nail to a cross. They had thrown one of their best legions into the oven and gotten back ashes and a few hollow-eyed survivors. Augustus never named it a defeat. In his own record of his deeds, the Res Gestae, carved in bronze and copied across the empire, he lists his conquests with pride and turns the Arabian March into a single line about how his army reached the land of the Sabaeans. He dressed the failure as an advance and let the desert keep the truth. Gallus kept his post as prefect a while longer, then faded from the record, a man who had led 10,000 into the sand and led back a fraction. But the men who came home knew, and the generals who would follow them east knew. The machine had failed. And in the minds of the high command, one question began to burn. Does the machine adapt, or does it break? The disaster in Arabia forced a cold reckoning. Rome's arrogance had been scoured away by sand, and what was left underneath was one blunt truth. An army in the east did not march on its stomach. It marched on its water. That truth changed everything. Roman logistics were already the finest supply system in the ancient world. Now they were aimed at a new enemy, not a king, not a legion, the land itself. The goal of a campaign stopped being the capture of a city. It became the hunt for water. And the heroes of this new war were not the centurions at the front. They were the exploratores, the scouts. These men rode out days ahead of the column on tough local horses, later on camels. They were not looking for enemy patrols. They were reading the ground, a shallow dip that marked a dead riverbed, a thread of green that betrayed a spring, faint tracks worn by nomads leading to a hidden well. A scout who could taste the salt in the soil and tell you whether the water below was fit to drink was worth more than a cohort. A scout who came back with news of good water was cheered louder than one who came back with an enemy chief's head. Finding water was the victory. Everything else came after. That hunt set the rhythm of the legion's whole day. Building the marching camp, the castra, was a Roman ritual older than the empire. The historian Polybius, writing 2 centuries before all this, had already recorded how the surveyors went out first with colored flags and staked the ground into the same grid every night, so that a soldier could find his own tent in the dark, in a camp he had never seen. Every night, however spent the men were, they dug a trench, threw up an earth rampart, and drove in a palisade of stakes each man carried on his own back. A clean rectangle of order stamped onto a formless world. In the desert, that rectangle got a new heart. The camp was built around the water. Find a well, and the general's tent, the praetorium, was placed to watch over it. Find nothing, and the digging began. Hundreds of legionaries stripped off their armor in the heat and worked in shifts with pick and dolabra, the iron entrenching axe every man carried, driving a shaft down through sand, then clay, then rock, hammering toward the water table. The sound of it carried across the camp, iron biting stone, hour after hour, a rhythm that meant life was still possible. The moment a shovel came up wet, a shout went through the camp. Then the immunes took over, the engineers exempt from ordinary labor. They shored the well with timber or stone and ran the distribution. Lines formed, not for food, but for water. Each man handed over his leather skin, his uter, to be filled. Thousands of skins and heavy barrels had to be topped off and loaded onto the animals before the legion could move at dawn. It broke the back to do it, and it had to be done again the next day, and the next. That was the price of staying alive. There was a science under all of it. Frontinus, the man who later ran the aqueducts of Rome and wrote a book on military stratagems, gathered the tricks generals used to survive dry ground. He recorded commanders who marched by night to spare their men the sun, who cut the water ration by measured amounts to stretch a supply, who set guards on every spring so no man could drink himself dead the instant he found it. Water discipline was as strict as battle discipline, and the punishment for breaking it was the same. Frontinus also tells of Julius Caesar in Africa, cut off from water by the enemy, who dug down along the coast until he struck a spring in the sand and saved a thirsty army. The lesson was written down and passed on. The ground almost always held water. You had to be willing to break your men to reach it. Rome's genius was that it learned. The legion had been built for the hills of Italy, and its transport showed it. Heavy wooden carts pulled by oxen carried the bulk of the supplies. In Arabian sand and broken rock, those carts were dead weight. Wheels sank. The oxen, bred for cool country, died fast from heat and thirst, and a dead ox in the road stopped every cart behind it. The answer stood in front of them, in the hands of the people they had come to conquer. The camel. The Roman quartermasters gave it up reluctantly, then all at once. They traded ox carts for camel trains. The animal was living desert engineering. It carried hundreds of pounds. Its wide padded feet crossed soft sand where a wheel would bury itself. And it went days without drinking, its own body the reserve. Soon whole legions were fed by camel caravans strung out for miles, a slow river of supply linking the army to its base. Documents dug up at Roman forts in the eastern desert record the camel as standard army property, bought, branded, and counted like any other piece of kit. Rome did not just adopt the camel, it put the camel in uniform. New units of camel-mounted troops appeared, the dromedarii, often men drawn from local tribes who had known the desert since birth. An inscription names them plainly in the army rolls of the eastern provinces. They scouted the far ground and guarded the supply lines. A legionary swaying on a lurching camel must have looked absurd. It was the look of an empire willing to throw out its own habits to win. The Romans went further. They stopped fighting the caravan trade and took it over. On the edge of the Syrian desert, the city of Palmyra grew rich as the middleman between Rome and the East, its merchants funding armed camel guards to escort goods across the waste. Rome watched, taxed, and eventually absorbed it. Their tax law, carved on stone and still readable, set a price on every camel load that passed the gates. In the far south, they built a chain of forts and cisterns along the desert roads, garrisoned by auxiliaries who did nothing but hold the water so the caravans and the legions could cross. The road they cut through Nabatea after annexing the kingdom in 106, the Via Nova Traiana, ran from the Red Sea to Syria with a fort at every stage. The empire had learned that in this country you did not conquer the land in one march. You held the wells one by one, and the land came with them. But the sharpest weapon in this war was not the sword, the spear, or even the camel. It was a sour drink called posca. It tasted foul. cheap wine gone to vinegar, cut with water, sometimes fixed with herbs. Every legionary got a ration. This was not comfort, it was medicine. The water they found was often stagnant, muddy, alive with the microbes that carried dysentery and typhoid, sicknesses that could hollow out a legion faster than any battle. The acetic acid in the vinegar killed those pathogens and made bad water fit to swallow. That was the first job, purification. The second job mattered more. A man marching under that sun could sweat out liters an hour, and with the water went his salts. Lose the salts, and you get cramps, heatstroke, the body shutting down. Posca, mixed with salt, put the salts back. It was the ancient world's sports drink, brewed from garbage, cheap, ugly, and the reason the legions kept their feet. The soldier hated the taste. He drank it anyway. It was the taste of survival. There is a story about the Emperor Hadrian, who marched the frontier armies himself in the 2nd century and shared their fare. His biographer says he ate the camp diet in the open, bacon and cheese and posca, to show his men there was no drink beneath a soldier that was beneath an emperor. The vinegar was so bound to the ranks that when a man at the foot of a cross lifted a sponge of it to a dying prisoner in Judea, he was not mocking him. He was sharing the standard issue of the army. The full expression of this war against nature came in AD 73 in the Judean desert. On a flat-topped rock rising sheer from the wasteland stood the fortress of Masada, the last hold of the Jewish rebels who still defied Rome after the fall of Jerusalem 3 years earlier. Herod the Great had built the place a century before as a refuge for himself, and he had built it for exactly this kind of siege. Cliffs on every side, a double wall along the summit, a private palace terraced into the northern cliff so the king could look out over a drop that made men dizzy. Rock-cut cisterns that trapped the winter floods off the mountain, holding enough water for years. Storerooms that Josephus says still held grain and wine and oil fresh enough to eat when the Romans finally climbed in. The rebels who held it were the Carrhae and the knife men, led by Eleazar ben Yair. The general sent to take it was Lucius Flavius Silva, governor of Judea. He understood that to break the fortress, he first had to break the desert around it. He did not repeat the error of Aelius Gallus. He did not open in high summer. He waited for the cool months and made the weather his first ally. His legion, the 10th Fretensis, reached the base of the mountain and did not attack. It built. First, a wall of circumvallation, a stone ring thrown right around the foot of Masada, over 2 miles of it, sealing the defenders inside. Then 8 fortified camps for the legionaries and the auxiliaries and the thousands of Jewish prisoners forced to labor. You can still trace the outline of those camps in the ground today, laid out in the same grid Polybius described, complete with the raised platform where a general could address the assembled men. All of it had to be fed and watered, and the water came by donkey and camel from the springs at En-Gedi, a hard march up the shore of the Dead Sea. Josephus, who had once commanded rebel troops himself before he went over to Rome, marveled that the Romans had to import everything, food, timber, and water, into a place that grew nothing. Every mouthful a legionary swallowed on that siege had been carried up from somewhere else on the back of an animal. The Siege of Masada was not a battle. It was the largest engineering project ancient warfare had ever seen. Silva chose the western face, where a spur of natural rock already climbed partway up the cliff. To push his engines the rest of the way, he needed a ramp, so he ordered his men to build a mountain onto a mountain. For months the soldiers and the prisoners hauled earth, rock, and timber under the eye of the engineers. The ramp rose foot by foot. The defenders on the summit could only watch the artificial slope climb toward them, and they knew what it meant. There was a cruelty in the choice of laborers. Josephus says the Romans drove Jewish captives to carry the fill, so the men on the wall would not loose their arrows freely on their own people below. The fortress was being conquered by the hands of its own countrymen. They were not losing to tactics or to swords. They were losing to logistics. They were being pressed flat under the organized weight of an empire that had decided they would fall. When the ramp was done, the Romans built a stone platform on top of it, rolled up an iron-plated siege tower, and swung a battering ram against the wall. The outer wall cracked. Behind it, the defenders had thrown up a second wall of timber and packed earth, built to give under the blows instead of breaking. So the Romans set it on fire. Josephus says the wind first drove the flames back toward the siege tower, and the Romans feared for their own engine. Then the wind swung and threw the fire deep into the wall and burned it through. The Romans slept that night on the ramp, sure of the storming to come at first light. That storming never came. Josephus reports that Eleazar gathered the defenders in the dark and told them death by their own hand was better than slavery under Rome. The men killed their wives and children, then drew lots, and 10 men killed the rest, and 1 man killed the 9 and fell on his own blade. When the 10th Fretensis climbed the ramp at dawn expecting a last fight, they found silence and around 960 dead among the stores that had been left untouched to prove the defenders chose death over hunger. 2 women and 5 children had hidden in a cistern and lived to tell what happened. The one survivor who could speak led the Roman officers through the palace and told them the whole of it, and Josephus set it down from her account. The siege had been won months before, not by the men on the ram, but by the engineers, the quartermasters, and the endless supply train. Silva had not merely attacked Masada. He had conquered the desert and held it as a province until the job was done. The 10th Fretensis stayed on that rock afterward, and their stamped tiles and their coins still turn up in the ruins, the mark of an army that did not leave until the land was theirs. Masada is a monument to Roman engineering, studied by soldiers for 2,000 years. The book that anchored today's deep dive, the source we used to rebuild this war against the sun, lays out the logistical genius and the human cost of these campaigns without flinching. For anyone who wants to go deeper than a video can reach, that sourcebook is available right now. Click the View Products button on your screen. On that shelf, you will find the book that inspired this script, along with a chosen set of themed relics of Rome, picked to sit beside the stories we tell. Open the shop and look while the story runs. It is the surest way to bring a piece of this history into your own home. The whole system was a masterpiece of planning and adaptation. It anticipated the problems and engineered the answers. For decades it worked. The legions marched, dug their wells, drank their posca, and won. But the desert is patient. It owns all the time there is, and 1,000 ways to kill. The Roman machine was brilliant. It was also rigid. It rested on one assumption, that a solution could always be built, that water could always be found, that discipline and labor could solve any crisis the land threw up. It was ready for everything but one thing. What happens when the scouts, the hard men who read the desert like a map, ride back into camp with fear in their eyes instead of good news? When they report that the wells the whole legion is counting on are gone, poisoned by a Parthian column falling back, or simply, without warning, run dry. In that one moment, the magnificent machine does not slow. It shatters. The news does not arrive as a shout. It arrives as silence, a stillness that starts in the general's tent and spreads outward. The scouts stand before the command staff. Their faces are burned near black, skin cracked like old leather. They do not need to speak. The truth is, in the way they cannot meet the general's eyes, in the way their shoulders drop with a weight heavier than any report of an enemy army. The wells are dry. The word moves from the tent guards to the centurions, from the centurions down to the ranks. It travels on the hot wind like something you catch, and the whole Roman system, built on prediction and preparation and the certainty that Roman will bend any obstacle, comes apart in that one breath. The plans on papyrus, the march timetables, the marked wells, all of it turns to trash. The legion stops being an army. It becomes 10,000 men standing in the middle of an ocean, watching the ship vanish from under their feet. This was no imagined fear. It was the exact trap that closed on Mark Antony in 36 BC. He led perhaps 100,000 men into Media against Parthia, and the campaign broke not in battle, but on the retreat. Plutarch, whose own grandfather passed down accounts of the disaster, describes the column staggering back through the Armenian mountains in early winter. The Parthians shadowed them and fouled the water. When the men reached a river at last, some drank so fast from poisoned or brackish pools that they died on the bank where they knelt. Antony lost around a third of his army, some 20,000 infantry, most of them to cold, hunger, and thirst rather than the sword. He is said to have cried out for a soldier to run him through rather than watch the ruins spread. 27 times on that retreat, Plutarch says, the Parthians attacked and were beaten off, and still the army melted. The East had already taught the same lesson to Crassus at Carrhae. Now it taught the man who would fight Octavian for the whole empire. Panic in a legion is not loud. It is cold and quiet. It is the sharp focus in a man's eyes as he weighs the few swallows left in his skin. He looks at the soldier beside him and, for the first time, does not see a brother. He sees a rival for water. The bond forged in 100 battles is replaced in a heartbeat by the arithmetic of survival. There is not enough for everyone. That fact settles over the camp like a cloth over a corpse. The centurions feel it before they see it. The armor goes unpolished. The evening meal is eaten in a dead, watchful quiet. No jokes, no boasts, every man alone with his own count. The sound that fills the camp is the small one, leather creaking, a skin sloshing as a man shakes it to judge what is left, the dry rasp of breath through cracked lips. The general stands in his tent over a map that now shows him nothing but a sentence of death. His career, his life, 10,000 lives, all of it hanging on a thread of hope too thin to see. The desert has him in check. In a world without rules, improvisation becomes the only law. The soldier bred on regulation turns scavenger. The stories that survive tell of men finding a deep well, the water 100 feet down, far past the reach of any rope they carried. So they invented one. They tore their tunics into strips and knotted them into a fragile chain of red wool. To the end, they tied the felt liner of a helmet, the soft cap that padded the iron. They lowered it into the dark and felt it touch the water, a faint splash that was the finest sound in the world. Then they hauled it up hand over hand, the wet cloth heavy with their lives. They did not drink from it. They wrung it out, squeezing muddy, foul drops into their cupped hands. They were destroying the uniform that made them Roman for one more sip. The man at the well was no longer a legionary. He was a creature made of thirst. Some went further and drank what should never be drunk. On Antony's retreat, Plutarch says the men grew so desperate they chewed roots and unknown herbs, and one plant drove them mad. A soldier who ate it lost his memory and his mind. and spent his last hours turning over every stone he could find, as if some great task depended on it, until he vomited bile and died. The only cure the army found was strong wine, and there was little of it. The whole camp bent to the same senseless labor before the poison took them. Thirst did not simply kill the body. It unmade the man inside it. This was the last stage of the collapse. Discipline did not crack. It boiled off like water on hot stone. The centurion's vine staff, the vetus, was the badge of his power. Disobey an order, and you felt it across your back. It broke men in Germania. It broke men in Gaul. Tacitus records a centurion, the soldiers nicknamed Sado Alterum, bring me another, because he snapped his vine staff on their backs. So often he kept calling for a fresh one. When the legions mutinied, they hunted that man down first. But a soldier whose tongue has swollen shut and whose kidneys are failing does not fear the vetus. He does not fear a flogging. He does not fear the executioner. He fears one thing only: dying slowly of thirst. So the order of command turns upside down. The general is no longer the strongest man in the army. He is the most exposed. He led them here. His plan failed. The silent, hating stares of thousands of armed men follow him as he walks the camp. The whispers start low, then grow. Talk of turning back. Talk of taking the water the officers kept for themselves. A dry legion is a powder keg with 10,000 fuses. Rome had watched it blow before. Tacitus describes the great mutinies of AD 14, the moment Augustus died, when the legions on the Rhine and in Pannonia turned on their officers over pay and years of service. They beat centurions to death and threw the bodies over the rampart, and one soldier, set to digging trenches, killed the officer who drove him and lit the whole revolt. The men demanded their discharge, their back pay, the same terms the praetorians in Rome enjoyed. It took the young prince Germanicus, standing before them with his wife and small son sent away to safety, to talk them down, and even then he drew his own sword and threatened to fall on it before they yielded. If cold, fed men could do that over money? A general on dry ground knew what a parched army could do to him. His worst enemy was no longer the Parthian cavalry shadowing the column. His worst enemy marched at his own back. One wrong move, one ration seen as unfair, and the men he commanded would pull him apart before the enemy ever reached him. In that crisis, when engineering and discipline and the gods of Rome have all failed together, the command has to swallow its pride and turn to what it despises: the foreign, the irrational, the magical. Cassius Dio hands down a scene from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on the throne, dated to around AD 172. During the war against the Quadi along the Danube frontier, a Roman force was trapped in a treeless valley baking under the sun. The enemy held the high ground and let the heat do their work. They ringed the valley and waited, knowing that if they simply held the line, the Romans would drop where they stood. For days the men cooked in place, too weak to lift their shields, standing in formation and waiting to die. Dio says thirst and wounds and the sun together had brought them to the edge of surrender. Then a man came forward. Dio names him Arnuphis, an Egyptian who traveled with the army. He said he could call his own gods to save them, and he named Hermes of the air among them. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic who filled his private notebook with lines on reason and on how to meet death without complaint, was out of everything but desperation. He gave his consent. Arnuphis worked his rites and called on his animal-headed gods. The sky went dark. A storm broke open directly above the Roman lines. Rain fell in sheets. The soldiers tipped their heads back, mouths open, and caught the water in their helmets and on their shields. Dio adds a detail that stays with you. When the enemy charged into the confusion, the Romans drank and fought at the same moment, blood from their wounds running into the water in their helmets, and they swallowed it together and did not stop. The same storm turned into a weapon. Lightning and hail hammered the quadi, threw them into chaos, and let the Romans surge forward and win. The scene was thought worth carving onto the column raised in Rome to Marcus Aurelius, where the rain god still stretches his arms over the drenched soldiers in stone, water pouring from his outstretched hands and running off the shields below. A century and more later, the Christians of the empire claimed the miracle for their own prayers instead of the Egyptians, and the argument over who really called the rain went on for generations. The unit passed into legend as the Thundering Legion. Fact, coincidence, or propaganda, the meaning holds. In its hour of need, the supreme command of Rome, led by the emperor himself, set aside Jupiter and Mars and put its trust in a foreign sorcerer. It was an admission spoken without words. Against the power of nature, Roman pride was worth nothing. When everything else was gone, the wells dry, the ranks near mutiny, the gods silent, a commander had one tool left: his own body. The stories of generals walking with their men became legend. Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, sent by Nero to fight in Armenia around AD 58, drove his soldiers through a winter in the mountains so harsh that Tacitus says sentries froze to death at their posts, and one man carrying firewood had his hands drop off, frozen and dead, still gripping the load. Corbulo marched among them bareheaded, ate what they ate, kept them digging and drilling even in peace, and executed deserters at the first offense, where other generals waited for the third. The army that came out the far side was the hardest in the empire, and it took the Armenian capital of Artaxata and burned it. Trajan, conquering Dacia in the early 100s, is remembered drinking the same water as the ranks and tearing his own clothing into bandages for the wounded when the field dressings ran out. These were not gestures of humility. They were not attempts to be liked. They were acts of dominance, cold and deliberate. By enduring the same hell in plain sight, the general staged a kind of theater. He showed that his own capacity for suffering ran deeper than theirs. He shamed them into silence. The legionaries, stumbling under his load, throat raw, would look up and see a man of wealth and rank taking the same punishment without one word of complaint. The message cut like a blade. If your general can bear this, who are you to break? Your pain is nothing. Carry it. That was the last rivet holding the machine together. A discipline enforced not by the vine staff, but by the weight of a stronger will. The empire never stopped feeding men into that ground. Trajan pushed east in 116 and reached the Persian Gulf, the farthest Rome ever marched. He stood on the shore, watched a ship set sail for India, and said aloud that if he were younger, he would have gone on to the borders of that land as Alexander once did. Within 2 years, the provinces he had conquered rose behind him. The desert supply lines failed, and the cities he had taken slipped away one by one while he lay dying on the road home. His successor Hadrian looked at the account and gave the whole eastern conquest back, pulling the border to the Euphrates where the water ran. The lesson repeated across 2 centuries. Rome could reach the water's edge of the world and could not hold the dry land in between. The legions that lived through these campaigns did not come home as conquerors. No triumph, no garlands, no wagons of plunder. They came home as survivors. Men who had walked into the furnace and somehow walked back out. They were changed. You could see it in the eyes, a hollow distance that never fully left. Their skin was burned to the color of dark wood and cut with lines that made young men look old. Many carried the scurvy for the rest of their days, teeth gone, gums scarred, the joints stiff in cold weather from the marches that had once locked them tight. They talked less than other veterans. They did not boast. What was there to boast of? They had not toppled a great king or sacked a famous city. They had outlasted the sun for one more day, and then another, and another. When Rome discharged such men and settled them on land, it often gave them plots in the same dry provinces they had bled in Syria, in Arabia, in Africa, and they spent their old age staring at the horizon that had nearly killed them, teaching younger men how to read the ground for water in a country that buried it deep. They had seen the real edge of Roman power. For all its engineering, all its iron discipline, all its claim to rule the world, the empire was a fragile thing. It could beat any army of men. It could flatten any city human hands had built. It could not beat a landscape. The wells at Carrhae, the sands of Arabia Felix, the frozen passes where Antony's men fell, the trap of the Quadi Valley, all of them returned the same verdict. The desert stayed undefeated, a silent monument to a god of sun and sand that Rome would never bring to heel. Thank you for staying with this investigation all the way to the end. If this story reached you and you believe these journeys into the dark corners of history matter, subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with one person who needs to see it. You've just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. Now look at your screen. Another story is already waiting, chosen for you. Click it and carry on into the past. We will see you there.